Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it may only be 310 miles long, but the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland is still proving a major block on the road to Brexit. Speaking in Belfast, the Prime Minister called on the EU to evolve its position on the issue. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, responded that he's open to any solution that's legally workable. Mr Barnier also welcomed Mrs May's Brexit white paper, the one that triggered a slew of resignations in Westminster, but questioned whether some of it could work in practice. Our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, has the latest.
The protesters often turn out for Theresa May, but the problems of Brexit follow her everywhere. Today, she was in Belfast with a plea and a promise. A promise there'd be no hard Irish border when the UK leaves, and a plea to the EU. She'd compromised on her Brexit plan, now it was Brussels' turn.
The White Paper represents a significant development of our position. It is a coherent package. It is now for the EU to respond, not simply to fall back onto previous positions which have already been proven unworkable.
As for the border, her plan sees goods moving freely between the UK and the EU, including Ireland, with no customs or other checks. So no special status for Northern Ireland, no undermining the Union.
The solution that we have put forward is a practical, workable solution to do that, which respects the vote of the British people, protects jobs, but also ensures that we don't see a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
In Brussels, the stage was set for an important moment. How would the British compromises go down? EU foreign ministers had met and set the tone. Wary, not convinced, at least not yet.
I will remain an optimist, but it's hard to be an optimist in these challenging times.
We will work on the basis of our principles and see to what extent our British partner fully gets it, including the British Parliament.
Then it was the negotiator's turn. He wasn't ready to buy Britain's offer as it stood, but he was willing to talk. There are several elements that open the way to a constructive discussion, he said. But his doubts and questions piled up. How could Britain trade with Europe's single market without following the same rules? What about protecting EU consumers? And in plain English, the EU was ready to contemplate the outcome many fear most, talks ending in no agreement.
Even if we want to reach a deal, it is also our responsibility to be prepared for all scenarios, including a no deal. As the European Council said, we have to step up preparation at all levels for all scenarios.
This was no moment of breakthrough, and it was never likely to be. There'll be some relief in government that the British plan wasn't dismissed out of hand. But now the going gets really tough. Brussels will want more concessions, and there are some MPs who are already plotting mutiny when and if those concessions are made. As things stand, senior figures on all sides are telling me it's hard to see Mrs May's blueprint getting through Parliament in the autumn. As MPs prepare for their summer break, Brexit looks like a crisis waiting to happen.
Also ensures that there isn't a border effectively down the Irish Sea.
If only all talks were as friendly as this. But nothing's easy just now. Not her party, not Parliament, not Brussels, not Brexit. Certainly not Brexit. John Pienaar, BBC News.
Well, let's get more from our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticus, who's in Brussels for us this evening. So, Damien, how much do you get a sense there of how much this talk from Mr Barnier and others is brinkmanship, and how much is a real fear that there will be no deal?
I think some of it, Fiona, is there's brinkmanship, of course, in negotiations, in any negotiations, but much, much more is real concern that, yes, these negotiations could founder on this issue of Northern Ireland and the border. Mr Barnier, his demeanour today, he was looking very determined but very, I think, stressed as well, because he said that there has to be a solution on this issue to have a withdrawal agreement or there's a chaotic Brexit. So he said he's prepared to address any plan that is put on the table or amend his. But I think crucially the EU also signalled, the ministers here today, that they are not changing their position. And Mr Barnier, in his response to that white paper, He welcomed it as the basis for talks, but he also poked many holes in it, saying how could the EU trust the UK to collect taxes and there not be fraud or customs duties? How could it protect consumers if the UK diverged on rules in some areas? Many problems he sees with it. And ministers from the EU 27 remaining countries here today, they said talks are entering a critical moment and they are concerned that the risks of no deal are rising.
Damien in Brussels, thank you.
Theresa May's Brexit plans were dealt a major blow by Brussels today, with the EU's chief negotiator questioning whether they would even work. Michel Barnier said Mrs May's new proposals for customs arrangements risked fraud, adding unnecessary red tape, and still didn't resolve the issue of the Irish border. Well, it came as the Prime Minister visited Northern Ireland to promote the plan, urging the EU to evolve its position, which she says is currently unacceptable. From Belfast, our political correspondent Carl Dinnan reports on a Brexit stalemate.
Good morning, everybody. Theresa May had a message for the EU in Belfast today. She said Britain had a free trade proposal that fixes the Irish border problem.
It is now for the EU to respond, not simply to fall back onto previous positions which have already been proven unworkable, but to evolve their position in kind.
She agreed there could be no hardening of the Irish border.
In the Northern Ireland of today, where a seamless border enables unprecedented levels of trade and cooperation north and south, any form of infrastructure at the border is an alien concept.
But she again dismissed the EU's backstop proposal to keep Northern Ireland in the customs union if the free trade agreement fails. Now, the Prime Minister doesn't want that backstop to ever be necessary. She wants the relationship between the UK and EU to be managed through a free trade agreement. But in Brussels, optimism is fading that that will be possible. The chief negotiator sceptical about Mrs May's new proposals, especially on Britain collecting EU tariffs.
N'y-a-t-il pas un risque majeur de fraude?
Is there not a major risk of fraud? What would be the financial and administrative extra costs be for businesses given this new dual system? Now, Brexit cannot and will not justify additional bureaucracy.
And he rejected Britain's characterisation of his backstop.
We are not asking for a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. We are open to any solutions. Even if we want to reach a deal, it is also our responsibility to be prepared for all scenarios, including a no deal.
None of this helps if you're running a business. Trevor Donald's drivers cross and recross the border. Many of his customers are already on tight margins.
Every morning you come to work, you don't know what the next hurdle is going to be, because you don't know what's on people's heads, what they're thinking. Businesses could close down, business could close up over this. Fingers crossed that it does go the soft border way for, I think, everybody's point of view. And it's to me, it's not rocket science.
As negotiators enter the final stretch, there may still be some positioning going on, but with only 13 weeks left to come up with a deal, they are running out of road. Carl Dinnan, ITV News, Belfast.
And our political correspondent Paul Brand joins me live now from Brussels. Paul, is there more than just that issue of Northern Ireland to resolve with the EU?
Plenty, Alistair. We've heard a lot of talk from Theresa May today about the EU evolving its position, but they already think her plan has mutated into something pretty ugly here. Michel Barnier gave himself 2 weeks to study her proposals, and he came up with a long essay in response, which he duly delivered this afternoon, mentioning everything from the Northern Irish border to Gibraltar to Britain's military base in Cyprus. But fundamentally, his big concerns still boil down to these 4 freedoms at the heart of the EU, which ironically are imprisoning Theresa May in these negotiations. So he questioned why she wanted free trade in some goods but not others, why her plan didn't apply to services. He accused the UK of trying to get one over on the EU to gain some kind of competitive advantage. He said the whole thing would be far too bureaucratic. The two sides are still worlds apart in these negotiations, with neither willing to budge, which is why in the past couple of days here in Brussels I've heard a lot of talk, not of a deal, but of no deal, which is where much of the energy is now being focused.
Paul, thank you.
Well, returning to today's developments, and Theresa May's Brexit proposals have been called into question by Europe's chief negotiator, who raised a whole string of objections to her new white paper. Michel Barnier said plans for a facilitated customs agreement opened up the risk of fraud, more bureaucracy and damage to European business. Mrs May, who's just visited the Irish border, declared the EU should evolve their position and not fall back on unworkable positions. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
Theresa May was in Northern Ireland for a second day today and began by meeting young people at an arts centre. The prime aim of her visit has been to reassure people at a time when local firms fear uncertainty over Brexit could soon put Northern Ireland into recession. The PM told business and the press that following last week's Brexit white paper, the ball is now in the EU's court.
It is now for the EU to respond, not simply to fall back onto previous positions which have already been proven unworkable, but to evolve their position in kind. And on that basis, I look forward to resuming constructive discussions. I firmly believe that we can complete what we have started.
And indeed, ministers from the other EU states met in Brussels today to discuss the state of play on Brexit, including the British White Paper. For them, the priority right now isn't the long-term relationship, but settling the withdrawal agreement well before Britain leaves next March.
We have to be ready in October to adopt the withdrawal agreement, because after that you have to ratify it in Britain and we have to ratify it with the European Parliament. So this is the priority.
Time is running out, the clock is ticking, and that's why I'm a little bit nervous. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. The EU negotiator Michel Barnier expressed serious concerns about the white paper. It would mean a major risk of fraud, he said. But for him, the urgent matter is the withdrawal agreement and ensuring no hard Irish border immediately after Brexit. So both sides need to agree a so-called backstop.
All 27 member states insist on this. Why? Because we are committed to protecting Ireland and Northern Ireland against the consequences of Brexit and to preserve the Good Friday Agreement in all its dimensions.
In Belfast, speaking against the unusual backdrop of a demonstration in line of sight by Sinn Féin, Mrs May again rejected the Commission's existing backstop plans. She says they'd involve a new border between Britain and Northern Ireland down the Irish Sea.
Under their proposal, Northern Ireland would be represented in trade negotiations and in the World Trade Organization on tariffs by the European Commission, not its own national government. The economic and constitutional dislocation of a formal third country customs border within our own country is something I will never accept, and I believe no British Prime Minister could ever accept.
But the Irish government say that on this thorny issue of a backstop for the Irish border, the ball's in Britain's court.
We need to see a wording that is legally operable so that we can get some confidence into the system of negotiation, that the Irish backstop will be there and will be able to function to reassure people that there's a fallback position, or there's an insurance mechanism, if you like, to ensure that under any circumstances, really, there won't be border infrastructure re-emerging on the island of Ireland.
Thank you.
And as both sides step up plans for no deal, they've only got a few weeks to sort it all out.
Well, joining me now from Dublin is Vice President of the European Parliament and Irish MEP Mairead McGuinness. Michel Barnier really ripped apart Theresa May's white paper, but shouldn't the EU be making compromises too at this point?
I don't agree with your analysis of Michel Barnier's points at all today, because the white paper is a negotiating paper, which of course the European Union will not accept in full. It is about negotiations. And to some extent, when I listen to your report, which is quite instructive, there's a sense of Groundhog Day developing around this sensitive issue of Brexit. We had an agreement and have an agreement with the United Kingdom on sequencing, and we need a withdrawal agreement, including the Irish backstop and a transition period. Brexit agreed very soon by October, so that my Parliament, the European Parliament, and indeed the House of Commons can actually pass a verdict on it.
Sure.
And at this stage, we're not close to that point, and we need to get there.
But getting there will involve concessions on both sides, won't it, from the EU and the UK? Do you agree with that analysis?
What I agree with is that in negotiations, both sides come to the table with a position and you compromise around that position. However, the British Prime Minister at the very outset set very severe, in my view, red lines about a customs union and single market exit. The European Union is a union of 27 countries and are there to protect the European Union. The UK is leaving. So we are coming from very, very different perspectives, but there are two things we share in common. One is we want to make sure there is no hard border on the island of Ireland and that we have a good future relationship. But we need to do things in sequence and we need to do it rather quickly.
But do you accept that Theresa May's room for manoeuvre is rather limited by her Brexiteers?
Well, look, I was listening to your earlier report about Brexit and Russian links and all sorts of things, so I'm quite concerned overall about how Brexit came about, but not that, as it is, Brexit is going to happen. So I do agree with you that the British Prime Minister is not in the easiest of positions, and we accept that. But in a sense, we watched the political evolution and developments in the United Kingdom, but they're not part of our issue. We're trying to negotiate as a very united EU 27. We've been, I believe, quite patient. We've set out a timeline. The UK have agreed to that. We're coming towards the month of August, and I believe this week is important because there is a document on the table. We welcome that from the UK side, and we can work with that. But I think that it will take time to tease out the details, and we will have to see flexibility from the UK side in as much as you're asking that the EU be flexible.
Hasn't there got to be an end to the sort of tough talk we've seen from the Taoiseach, for example, on flights and the fact that UK flights wouldn't be able to fly over Ireland? I mean, that was sort of scaremongering, wasn't it?
Well, I do think it's quite interesting to look at the media interpretation of that story. And I, with respect to the UK media, and one of the Red Tops in particular, they misrepresented completely. But that's been the narrative around Brexit. When we speak of the implications of Brexit, it's very clear that the UK, and when people went to vote in the United Kingdom, weren't fully clear about what a Brexit would mean for their lives. They're now finding that out in detail, and it could impact on air travel. It could impact on the supply of pharmaceuticals. It can impact on every single aspect of our lives. And for any political leader, including myself, to point out these things is simply stating the fact. I do agree with you, though, on one thing. I think the language needs to be calmer from the UK side and from the Brexiteers, because it doesn't help us reach the place where we need to be in the best interests of our citizens.
Right.
I represent a border constituency with Northern Ireland, and I need that we find a good solution to this issue.
Mairead McGuinness, thank you very much for joining us. Well, let's go back to Michael Crick now, who's in Westminster, where the row over the Chief Whip's behaviour about Tuesday's key Brexit vote is still making headlines. So, Michael, just update us. What has happened today on this?
Well, Theresa May again has come to the defence of Julian Smith, the Chief Whip, over the events of Tuesday night, where there were a couple of very tight Brexit votes, one that the government won, one which they lost, and where Julian Smith asked the Conservative chairman, Brandon Lewis, to break his pairing arrangement with the Lib Dem Deputy Leader, Joe Swinson, who's away at the moment on maternity leave. Now, pairing arrangements are where one MP can't be in Parliament because they're ill or for some other good reason, and there's a sort of gentleman's agreement that somebody on the opposite party won't turn up and vote either in order to balance things out. This is what Theresa May said in Belfast this morning.
There was an honest mistake made, for which the Chief Whip and indeed Brandon Lewis have both apologised to the member concerned, the member for East Dunbartonshire, Joe Swinson.
Now, the trouble with the honest mistake line is that there's been growing evidence in the last 24 hours that what Julian Smith did with Brandon Lewis was part of a much wider operation. And indeed, the Sun newspaper said today that it had evidence that Mr. Lewis asked up to 5 MPs to break their pairing arrangements as well, although the other 4 refused. And the Sun says that there was a major row within the Whip's office. Now, if that is all true, it raises serious questions about Mr. Smith's integrity. And Labour have been calling on him to be sacked or to resign. The Labour's Deputy Leader, Tom Watson, said that Theresa May's explanation was unbelievable.
His conduct is unacceptable, and I'm afraid it's a breach of trust, and we're going to find it very difficult to work with this man going forward.
Do you think he should resign?
I think if he had any ounce of honour, he would resign, and if he doesn't resign, I think the PM should find the courage and the strength to sack him.
Can Mr Smith survive? Well, perhaps, because Parliament's only sitting for a couple more days before the holidays, but certainly it's done a lot of harm to his reputation and, I think, his authority.
Indeed, thanks, Michael, very much.
If you've ever tried to bunk off the last days of term, you'll know how Parliament felt this week. It wasn't the draw of warm, lazy evenings, but the horror of what the day job had become. The PM nearly called in the summer early to avoid tackling a bitterly awkward finale. In the end, they saw it through. Well, almost. There's a couple of days to go next week. But what a week this one has been. Dirty politics and broken promises mixed in with compromises and new shards of hope. And Michel Barnier dismissing many of May's demands on Brexit and reminding us we have but 13 weeks to produce a deal. So tonight we devote a significant part of the programme to asking if Brexit and the government will survive the summer and in what form they'll emerge in the autumn. Let me introduce you to our cast. Chris Wilkins wrote the Lancaster House speech and worked closely with the PM. He left Downing Street last year. Mairead McGuinness, a regular on this programme, is a member of the Irish governing party Fine Gael. Tom Baldwin wants to see a people's vote, just don't call it a second referendum. His new book, Control-Alt-Delete, has just come out. Ash Sarkar calls herself anarcho-fabulous, a self-described communist and Corbyn supporter. Christopher Montgomery is a Conservative who's worked for the DUP, as well as for Vote Leave, a body just this week referred to the police and fined. So here they are in the flesh, Christopher, Ash, Mairead, Chris and Tom. Welcome to you all. And we're going to look at the events in Northern Ireland in a moment. First, though, the woman at the centre of all this is still standing. Who'd have thought it? Chris, I'm going to start with you. You were by Theresa May's side for much of the last year. You wrote the Lancaster House speech, which pretty much set the whole tone for Brexit, signed off by Boris Johnson and David Davis, now gone. Are you surprised that she's made it this far?
I'm not surprised she's made it this far. I think, thinking back to Lancaster House, when I've anticipated everything that's happened since then, all the ups and downs, well, not quite, it's been quite a year. But I think the PM, has been said often, she has an incredible resilience, but not only resilience, I think an absolute determination, a sense of inbuilt duty to see through this task that she's been given.
Do you watch through your fingers now you're not there? I mean, when you were writing Lancaster House, was she properly behind that speech at the beginning, or did you feel that, you know, you were both sort of Remainers that had to get this one through?
I think she absolutely feels, as I say, a sense of duty, this task that she inherited, and thinks the result of the referendum was absolutely clear and she needs to see it through. And Lancaster House was, as you say, the starting point. What it was a sort of opening gambit to the negotiations, in essence. I think some people look back at that speech and think of it as a definitive statement of policy, which it wasn't necessarily. It was absolutely staking out an initial negotiating position.
Just before I leave this, people often sort of say, is there a plan? Has May had this sort of thread through all the way? Do you think she has? Do you think she knew right at the beginning what she wanted to be at in May of next year, or do you think she's making it up as she goes along?
No, there's definitely been a plan that she's working to. Has that plan been followed through at every stage? Well, not 100%, but elements of it certainly have. I think of one thing in particular, for example, I can think back when we had the discussions about the Brexit strategy when I was in Number 10, and one of the things we said was actually, you know, the December 2017 Council is the key council to get an initial agreement, and that was absolutely delivered. So it's not all gone according to the plan, but there definitely is one, and elements of it certainly have.
Tom, a quick thought from you. You work very closely with David Miliband, who was often... Ed Miliband, often a leader under fire. Can't believe I said that. Do you perceive Theresa May now as getting weaker or stronger in this role?
Well, look, it's certainly familiar watching an embattled leader struggling to survive. We certainly had our moments in those years. But what's unusual about this position is this is a critical moment in our country's history. And we have a leader of the Conservative Party, a Prime Minister, who is almost incapable, I think, now of acting in the national interest because she is driven by these needs of short-term political survival, how to manage the Conservative Party, how to manage Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is knocking lumps out of her already battered Chequers proposals earlier this week. This is about more than political survival of a Conservative Party leader. It's about the future of our country, the future of our young people. It's too important to be left to internal Conservative Party politics.
OK, let's have a look at where she was today. Theresa May, as I've told you, in Belfast. It's been 2 weeks since she published her Chequers plan, and at lunchtime we finally heard Europe's response. Michel Barnier saying the document provided a basis for constructive discussion. There were elements that could yet prove unacceptable to the EU. So she was there to sell the deal, an attempt to temper what was going on, and David Grossman followed her path from yesterday. Let's have a look.
A business bang on the border. Balik Pottery sits in County Fermanagh in the UK, but just yards away is County Donegal in the Republic. Their business right now depends on that border not just being soft, but imperceptible.
If things were to go really wrong, it could have devastating impacts for us here at Balik Pottery.
Existential, it could be the future of your business.
Oh yes, you know, if we had a hard border.
Yesterday, Balik hosted a visit by Theresa May, come to hear the concerns of businesses as she attempts to create a workable Brexit. Today, the Prime Minister was in Belfast to deliver what was billed as hard reassurance that the border wouldn't be.
I've said consistently that there can never be a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I said it in my letter triggering Article 50, in my speech at Mansion House, and many times besides. During the referendum, both campaigns agreed that the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland must remain absolutely unchanged.
Balik's managing director, John Maguire, who met Mrs May yesterday, watched today's speech with interest. His verdict? Good, but only as far as it went.
This has to be delivered over the next 6 to 9 months. And, you know, the end game is getting close here. And we're all watching this very, very closely, you know, including our customers. Like today, you know, we've had a customer from Korea who's potentially going to be doing business with our company, was asking, what about Brexit? Is this going to impact Balik? So, you know, everybody, the world is watching here, and we need to get this right.
The world too will have been watching the EU's first response to the UK's Brexit White Paper, delivered today by Chief Negotiator Michel Barnier. He didn't dismiss the proposals out of hand, but what will worry many in Northern Ireland is this.
Even if we want to reach a deal, it is also our responsibility to be prepared for all scenarios, including a no deal. As the European Council said, we have to step up preparation at all levels for all scenarios.
Meanwhile, at Balik, they continue to do what they've done for the past 160 years. But these days, they depend on shipping their pottery all over the world. Even a few hours' delay could mean lost orders. And like Dennis Daly, about a quarter of the workers here live in the Republic and have to cross the border to come to work. Already, the falling pound has hit their pockets.
We're losing about €300 a month now compared to before the Brexit vote. You were getting maybe 135, 140, 145 your pound sterling. Now you were getting 1.5. Now it's back up to 110, 112.
And were you reassured by the Prime Minister's visit yesterday?
Not particularly, no.
Really?
Yeah, it'd be better to try and get it sorted out in London and that there. It seems to be going on and on and on with no end to it, from what I can see.
At this distance to the border, the Brexit date of the 29th of March next year feels extremely close as well. Like a carefully balanced stack of pottery, the smallest jolt could cause disaster.
That was David Grossman. We're going to go to Dublin now and pick up with Mairead McGuinness. In his very diplomatic way, Michel Barnier has essentially poured cold water over the Chequers deal today, hasn't he? He's said it's basically a starting point, not an end deal.
Well, that's exactly what it is. It's a starting point. It's not an end deal. And indeed, the language when the Chequers paper was published in the British media was very much that this is a deal. But in fact, I think the British Prime Minister knows it is a document for discussion. I thought Michel Barnier was very balanced about this document. I think the tone of the document is helpful. And Michel Barnier has indicated that generally there is some positives in the document. But clearly, as we go through the details, we will not be able to accept everything that's in there. And I doubt if the British Prime Minister Minister would expect that to be the case.
But you know
I do think...
Sorry, you know how hard it is for her to sell anything softer to her own cabinet or government. So where does Europe meet her halfway? What are your red lines and where can you come towards us?
Well, I think the British Prime Minister set out red lines too early on and too deeply. And therefore, what we've always said from an EU perspective is that we're prepared to show flexibility if the British Prime Minister can show flexibility. And we all have welcomed the publication of the paper. I think events since the publication of the paper have given us cause for concern. And that's why I think it is appropriate that all member states, but the EU as a collective, is preparing for all scenarios.
Yeah.
And I think the United Kingdom is doing the same. I think that's prudent. We all want a good solution, and I think it's also important to reflect on. I do need to say this, because what I see from the UK side is a look at the future without dealing with the present. The people you spoke to from my constituency in that report want the withdrawal agreement, including the Irish backstop, to be dealt with, and we have a transition period before all of the details of a future partnership can be worked out. That's essential by October or the latest November. That's absolutely essential.
And briefly, this idea of all scenarios, if we crash out with no deal, Ireland is in a terrible place too, right, according to the IMF?
Well, none of us would be happy with that. We're very clear. I mean, Brexit is bad for everybody. The work we're all doing is to try and limit the damage. And I think the UK public are beginning to see from reports that you've produced this week on pharmaceutical sector and other sectors that there's no such thing as a benefit from Brexit. So we need to be very careful to get everything right. Let's get the withdrawal agreement sorted. Let's look at a future partnership that works for the European Union and the United Kingdom. And to some extent, all of the noise of the last 2 weeks really bring us back to where we started, which is the deal has to be done around the negotiating table in Brussels.
Mairead McGuinness, thank you so much. We're going to put that to Christopher Montgomery. You work for Vote Leave, and you've heard that put very bluntly, that Theresa May has to slide towards the EU. Is that going to work?
I didn't work for Vote Leave. I was director of Vote Leave. I was icing on the cake.
What does that mean as icing, then?
It means...
Did you back what they did in the campaign?
100%. I'm glad we won.
Yeah.
But you were speaking to a Fine Gael politician there. One of the great problems in all of this is, unfortunately, British press coverage is so parochial. Why didn't you ask her about what Leo Varadkar said about plane flights? He said this week that if they take back their fish, we're taking back our skies, and the British planes will fly across the Irish Republic.
Right there, so let's bring her in.
That was the sort of thing that was worthy of Donald Trump, not of a respectable politician not trying to make threats of his nearest and dearest neighbour.
May I come back in there, please? I really will have to just calm and object to what's being said there, because the Taoiseach clearly was spelling out some of the consequences if we don't do an agreement on Brexit. He wasn't threatening. He was simply stating the facts. I think what's interesting is how things are reported. And I would agree with you on one point. It is that the media has polarised the debate. And when people try and point out the downsides or the implications of Brexit, you're seen as threatening. Okay. And that is not the case, because remember, we also have difficulties with Brexit. So I really do think we have to be careful. Our Taoiseach is mindful of his duty as leader of our country and as a member of the European Union.
Thanks for clarifying that. I'm going to bring Christopher back in.
She says, let's deal with facts. Ireland has been a signatory to the International Convention on Civil Aviation since 1957. The things that Varadkar threatened, he can't do. The airspace that he threatens is controlled by the UK.
I'm sorry, he did not threaten.
It's ridiculous. So when you're dealing with people who aren't negotiating seriously, the British government obviously finds itself in a sticky position.
The point is, even as director, Vote Leave, you dedicated a year of your life to saying this would all be fine, that it was all going to be worked out. David Davis was saying it was going to be pretty easy. Liam Fox was talking about the ease of trade deals. It's a train wreck.
I think if Theresa May had put a quarter of the energy into stitching up the Europeans the way she stitched up David Davis, we'd have Brexit done by the stage we'd have Calais back.
Ash.
I mean, listen, I'm not one of those people that leaps out of bed with a renewed will to live to talk about institutional arrangements around tariffs, and I think that's the case for most people in this country. I think that the way in which that this conversation is shaped neglects the reasons why people have voted the way that they do, and neglects, I think, the real issues that are concerning people in this country, which are namely the protection of jobs and people's economic living standards.
We can't get on to any of that, you'll accept, until we sort out how we work out this Brexit. And at the moment, Labour, quite frankly, is playing politics rather than principle. If it is time to come together in a government of national unity, should Jeremy Corbyn join up?
I really reject this narrative around a government of national unity, because I think what people need isn't just...
This is a crisis, isn't it?
Isn't just Brexit being resolved, which I think is incredibly important, but it's also a wider political vision and wider economic changes. People were suffering in 2016 in real financial terms, and even if there was this government of national unity, which I think risks really disenfranchising and disempowering the general public, is that those things still won't be met. For me, the most important thing here is making sure that there is adequate and robust parliamentary oversight of the final deal.
Tom, you're never going to get another vote through this at the moment, are you? I know Justin Greening was putting that forward this week. That's not going to happen.
I think it's quite clear that more and more people from all walks of life, all parties and of none, are now concluding that people's vote is the only way to sort this mess out. It's apparent to everybody, I think, that there's no majority for Theresa May's bad deal. There's no majority for a no deal. You've got a Labour Party which says it will oppose any deal which doesn't meet its 6 tests, and I can't see how it can meet the 6 tests. And I'm afraid, and I've learnt a lot from Jeremy Corbyn's success in 2017, bold and principled leadership. But on this, the most crucial issue facing our country, I'm afraid Jeremy Corbyn's not being bold and principled. He's doing a sort of piece of Blairite triangulation. And what we want is boldness and principle. We want a Labour Party that stands up to the government on Brexit, and he should be backing people's vote. That's where lots of people in the Labour Party, 79% of Labour Party members in a membership-empowered party want a people's vote. It's time for the leadership to smell the coffee and back the people's vote.
So I'm personally referendum ambivalent. I don't think that it would be right to rule it out entirely, but I think that there are some very key questions that Remainers such as yourself would have to answer, which is, what would Labour winning that referendum look like? Would it be a soft Brexit deal? Would it be remaining? And if so, then what do you do with all those Labour voters who were brought back on side in 2017?
This is where we're
and
getting...
secondly, what do you do about a renewed and emboldened far right, who I think would be really hitting these notes around subverting democracy quite hard in a way which will make life very difficult for people of colour and migrants in this country? Those are my concerns first and foremost.
Well, I hate to hear that there's literally a far right. It's terrible if people espouse stupid extremist views from the past.
So who was on the streets of London just in the weekend gone, mate?
Communists. Far right.
Communists were on the street saying free Tommy Robinson.
Listen to what I'm saying. I'm saying that
I'm disagreeing with it.
No, you're also interrupting. I didn't interrupt you. It's just basic courtesy. If people are going to espouse appalling views, such as the people in the streets cheering on Tommy Robinson or the people in television studios cheering on communism, that's very disagreeable politics. I want to just pick up on one thing that Tom said. Tom said there's no majority. That's not true. There was a majority on Monday and Tuesday for doing Brexit. That's what got through the House of Commons.
This has been a week, and I said at the beginning, where we have seen a lot of dirty politics, things that have made our government, the Conservatives, look incredibly grubby in terms of the chief whip and the pairing. I wonder how you feel, Chris, looking in now on that party that you were so close to.
Well, I've been involved in Conservative Party politics for probably more than 2 decades now, and this is an issue that's been sort of hanging over the Conservative Party all this time, and it really is time to sort it out, I think, and front up to it. And I thought, actually, after Chequers, the Prime Minister had made the decision to really take on some of the more fringe elements of the Conservative Party and the hard Brexiteers.
By fringe, you mean the ERG?
People who back that position. And then on Monday, I felt that was slightly reversed again, so I thought that was unfortunate. But I think the other thing that you saw since Chequers and again this week is that for the Chequers agreement to work, where the Prime Minister has moved, the position has been softened over time. It's a position that you would have thought certain moderate elements of the Labour Party and people like that would get behind and see the direction of travel here.
Does
but actually, they've gone down this route of supporting the people's vote and actually attacking the Prime Minister rather than just taking the win effectively and then working with that.
Does it embarrass you, Christopher, that this is all happening within the Conservative Party before you've even got to Brussels, before you've even got to the negotiations?
I think it's a very great pity that the Prime Minister pulled out of her back pocket a policy that she and the civil service had cooked up, rather than the policy that her responsible ministers and the ex-EU thought they were cooking up. I thought that was very bad politics. It didn't lead to a car crash at the Chequers cabinet, but it led to a car crash in Parliament.
You distance yourself, if I can say that, a little bit from Vote Leave when I pushed him.
No, not at all.
OK,
no,
so perhaps
not
you can explain the financing issue that occurred with resolution this week. Fine £61,000 referred to the police. this is a really grubby state of affairs if you're asking the
As
public to trust
I understand it, Vote Leave are going to appeal that because they feel that it was absolutely absurd that no senior person in Vote Leave was interviewed by the Electoral Commission.
The Electoral Commission says you didn't engage properly with them. They threw that right back at
we
you.
say that they didn't engage with us. So there you go.
At the moment, who should we trust? I mean, if a member of the public is trying to make sense of this, and you've got
Emily, I'm going to. I'll tell you who we should trust. We should trust the people when they cast a vote. The government spent £9 million from public funds on pro-Remain propaganda, swamping any other sum of money spent by anyone.
We listened to Chris lecturing us about the use of facts. We know how Vote Leave used facts in the referendum. We also know what's happened since the referendum. When I support a people's vote, I'm not really talking about rerunning the last referendum. I'm talking about fighting on what's happened since. The £50 billion divorce bill, where nobody told us about. The broken promises on the NHS, the more money from Europe for the NHS, which is never going to appear. The way the politicians in Westminster, because they're too narrow and shallow, have botched your Brexit. No one thinks it's going well. 1 in 10 people in this country think it's going well. It is a democratic failure if we end up with a choice between a bad Brexit deal and a no deal. It's a choice between disaster and even bigger disaster. And if that's what you really think that we should be presenting to this country, you're not a Democrat.
OK, I'm going to ask you now to sum up a time machine to March 2019. I'm going to ask you very briefly, Mairead, sorry to come to you. Is May the Prime Minister this time, March of next year, and do we have a deal with you, with Europe?
I hope we have a deal, but what strikes me from listening to that conversation is that the referendum, which was supposed to deal with the relationship between Europe and the United Kingdom and solve all problems, has actually added more anger to the debate. I think that's quite depressing. Europe stands ready to negotiate, and that is what we are doing as soon as the United Kingdom is united on its position. And I'm fascinated about the debate about a future referendum. That's something, of course, I'd welcome, but I frankly don't see that happening, and I think we have to deal with the reality that the UK leaves at the end of March and get on with it.
I'm going to bring in the others now. Very unfair, but a two-word answer. Will May still be Prime Minister? Will we see a deal? Ash?
I don't think May will still be Prime Minister in March 2019, and I think that any discussion of softening Brexit, making sure it's in Britain's economic interest, has to go hand in hand with a wider programme of political and economic transformation.
I do think she'll be Prime Minister. I do think we'll have a deal, but I think at the end of this week, no deal is a little more likely than I'd ever thought.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.